Fort 4. Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas. The Dry Tortugas is a cluster of 7 coral islands and sandbars that continues westward from Key West near the southernmost tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. Bush, East, Garden, Hospital, Loggerhead, Long, and Middle Keys, as well as the incomplete Fort Jefferson on Garden Key, were designated as Fort Jefferson National Monument in 1935 and Dry Tortugas National Park in 1992. The park, which is part of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, covers 101 square miles of land and ocean. The islands were discovered in 1513 by the Spanish adventurer Juan Ponce de León and named for the tortoises that lived there. In 1825, a lighthouse was built on Garden Key and another in 1856 on the biggest key, Loggerhead. Fort Jefferson is the world's biggest all-masonry fortress. During the American Civil War, it remained in Union hands and was used as a jail until 1873. Among those imprisoned was Samuel A. Mudd, the doctor convicted of complicity in President Abraham Lincoln's assassination because he set John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. The park is only accessible by boat or aircraft. Its seas are rich with marine life, including 3 kinds of sea turtles. Thousands of migratory birds pause on the islands to rest or nest. A huge flock of sooty terns nests on Bush Key every spring and summer. Fort 3. Maunsell Sea Forts. During World War II in 1941, the British Admiralty and War Office decided that London and Merseyside required stronger anti-aircraft defenses. Amphibious forts were recommended as a remedy, and Guy A. Maunsell, a notable civil engineer hired by the government, created 2 unique designs. According to Maunsell's plans, the Navy would have 4 forts in the North Sea off the coast of Essex, and the Army would have 6 forts, with 3 in the Thames Estuary and 3 in Liverpool Bay. During World War II, the Thames Estuary sea forts were acknowledged for shooting down 22 enemy planes, sinking 1 E-boat, severely damaging another, and destroying 20 to 30 V-1 flying bombs. There were also several rescue missions carried out from the forts for pilots forced to ditch and land in the North Sea. These consisted of a boat-shaped reinforced concrete pontoon covered by a steel deck containing weapons and radar systems. The forts were mostly prefabricated and assembled in a specially modified dry dock basin at Gravesend by Holloway Brothers Limited. The 2 Navy fort towers each had 7 levels containing fuel, ammunition, water, and living quarters for the crew. The main deck had accommodations for the officers, and the Bofors deck housed fresh and seawater tanks, ventilation systems, and the main gun defenses. The control room had a landline connection to a shore-based HQ and was equipped with telephones, radios, and early radar technology. Each tower had a dolphin, which was a lattice steel docking platform equipped with a crane for loading supplies. When each fort had been commissioned and outfitted, it was pulled by tugboats to its final resting place with a full crew aboard. Once in place, the hollow legs were progressively filled with seawater until they sank to the bottom in less than half an hour. There were 4 Navy forts in the Thames Estuary. Sunkhead, Trinity House briefly explored acquiring this fort to serve as a lighthouse to mark the outer end of the Sunkhead Sands in the Barrow Channel, but there were fears that any settling of the fort on the seabed, making it list, would disrupt the lights, so the plan was ultimately rejected. Between October 1965 and April 1966, Tower Radio Tower used Sunkhead Fort. But when the funding for the project ran out, they abandoned Sunkhead, leaving behind a brand new generator and all of the broadcast equipment. Sunkhead, unlike some of the other forts, was well outside territorial seas, and when the Marine Etc. Broadcasting Offenses Act went into force in August 1967, the government was keen on ensuring that it didn't become a target. On August 18, 1967, the Sunkhead was boarded by a force of the 24th Field Squadron of Royal Engineers from Maidstone aboard the tug Collie, led by Major David Ives. Acetylene cutting torches were used to undermine the fort, and 3,200 pounds of explosives were detonated. 3 days later, the fort was blown up, leaving only 20 feet of leg stumps. Ruffs. On August 11, 1965, Jack Moore and his daughter Jane entered Ruffs Fort under the guise of implementing a project to renovate it to a fun palace and health complex, which was most likely a cover story for using the fort in some way more directly tied to Radio Caroline's operation. The upper residence of the fort was cut away during their tenure to make room for a helicopter landing pad. The fort was subsequently left unattended for a short period until being claimed by Roy Bates, proprietor of Radio Essex BBMS, in December 1966, shortly after his station closed. A fight ensued over the occupancy of Ruffs. While it was momentarily neglected by Bates, a boarding party from Radio Caroline retook the fort, only to be violently evacuated by Roy Bates and his crew. Once the Marine Etc. Broadcasting Offenses Act went into force, Radio Caroline intended to utilize Ruffs as a supply base, or perhaps to replace the Mi Amigo as a broadcasting base. On June 27, 1967, Radio Caroline deployed a squad of raiders from Harwich to the tender Offshore 2 to rescue Roy Bates from Ruff's tower. As one man attempted to board, petrol bombs and missiles were fired at him, leaving him hanging from the ladder as the Offshore 2 moved away. The individual was eventually rescued by a lifeboat, and despite police intervention, no charges were ever filed. Tongue Sands. Tongue Sands Fort had settled significantly badly when it was grounded, making it unstable. The fort rocked strongly on December 5, 1947, and sections began to tumble into the sea. HMS Uplifter rescued the caretaker crew after they sent a distress call. Divers eventually confirmed that the foundations were sound, but during a subsequent storm, the fort developed a 15-degree list, and the 4 surviving men had to be rescued by the Margate lifeboat. The Tongue Sands were eventually abandoned in 1949 after the pontoon broke its back, flooding the lowest levels of the fort. Due to its fragile condition, Trinity House briefly investigated Tongue Sands for use as a lighthouse, but due to its fragile condition, a lightship was anchored nearby until the mid-1980s. By the mid-1960s, when Radio Essex considered using Tongue Sands as a transmitting station for the projected Radio Kent, underscouring had further damaged the fort, massive holes had emerged in the east leg, seawater had inundated the lower levels, and the platform had become separated with huge gaps between the deck. The Radio Essex team saved all of the fort's priceless wire and metal. The Tongue Sands Fort ultimately crumbled into the underscoring pit during storms on the 21st and 22nd of February 1996, leaving only a single 18-foot stump of the south leg visible above sea level. Knockjohn. Radio City intended to utilize the Knockjohn Fort as the location for a new radio station. In mid-1965, they dispatched a small team to Knockjohn with a transmitter, a tiny generator, and numerous pieces of transmitting equipment. However, Roy Bates had intentions of utilizing the fort as a headquarters for his radio station, Radio Essex, and the Radio City team was removed from the fort in late 1965. From October 27, 1965 to December 25, 1966, Radio Essex BBMS transmitted from Knockjohn Fort. Fort number 2. No Man's Land. No Man's Land Fort was established to protect the coast from attack. It was then sold as a private island and transformed into a luxury hotel, and was the home of odd economic maneuvers that resulted in a property developer stealing the only set of keys and barricading himself within the island's stronghold. No Man's Land, one of 4 forts erected in the Solent Straits to protect the shipyards at Portsmouth, exemplifies the bizarre fates of Palmerston's Follies. A set of enormous fortifications built in Victorian times to safeguard the coast against anticipated French invasion threats. The Palmerston forts, which included No Man's Land, Spitbank Fort, St. Helens Fort, and Horsesand Fort, were the most expensive and comprehensive fortifications ever built in peacetime. Perhaps they functioned as a deterrent because the French army never invaded. No Man's Land was built over nearly 20 years for a hefty sum of $476,293. The cannon-laden armored artificial island, about 200 feet broad, was designed to house 80 men and 49 cannons. Originally, the submerged core of the circular fort offered shelter from the weather as well as a freshwater supply from a well drilled into the seabed. In World War I, it operated as a defense post against submarine assault, and in World War II contained anti-aircraft weapons, despite the fact that it never saw combat against the French. The fort was decommissioned in the 1950s and was sold by the military in 1963. It was converted into a luxury hotel in the 1990s, complete with 2 helipads, 21 guest rooms, a roof garden, and restaurants. The lower center was glassed in as an atrium for the heated pool. Regrettably, the isolated hotel never took off, and in 2004, developer Harmish Pooney purchased it for over $6 million with the aim of renting it out for special events, such as Wicked Henchmen's meetings or apocalyptic device planning sessions. Unfortunately for Pooney's goals, the tainted water in the hotel pool sparked a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, and his business suffered as a result. Although there were reports that Duran Duran's Simon Le Bon was considering buying it as a hideaway, it was placed up for sale in 2007 for nearly $4 million, but was not purchased. Faced with financial difficulties and the prospect of losing the island to creditors or new investors, Harmish Pooney did the only thing he could think of. He packed his belongings, took the keys, and barricaded himself inside the fortress. When he was interviewed in 2008, images of the property indicated a significant drop in standards: dead plants, filthy furnishings, and a half-empty pool filled with murky brown water. In early 2009, Mr. Pooney was eventually expelled. Most recently, No Man's Land was sold to Swanmore Estates Limited, a Gibraltar-based company, for the bargain price of $937,139. It is unknown what their plans are for the fortress, but they have renewed an application to create a floating breakwater and port, as well as another helipad. Fort 1. Bull and Hale Sand Forts. When World War I broke out in 1914, the fear of German naval activity in the North Sea, both from U-boats and the Grand Fleet, prompted a series of defenses along the east coast. The Humber Estuary was designated as a secure mustering point for convoys, and as a result, a variety of defenses were constructed to control the entrance. Along with the installation of 2 batteries on either side of Spurn Point, 2 forts were built in the estuary itself: Hale Sand Fort and Bull Sand Fort. Bull Sand Fort is the largest of the 2, built to control the main passage into the Humber Estuary. The fort was built on top of a submerged sandbank using 2 concentric steel rings driven into the ground and thousands of tons of chalk and debris deposited to make a sturdy foundation. The fort itself is a 4-level circular steel-framed concrete reinforced building. On its seaward side, 12-inch 30-centimeter armor was installed to withstand gunfire from powerful naval forces. It was equipped with 4 6-inch Mk7 guns as well as 4 searchlights. It could house 200 troops and had fresh water pumped into storage tanks from a natural stream beneath the sea floor. Because of the fort's intricacy, it wasn't actually finished until December 1919, over a year after the First World War ended. Bull Sand Fort was abandoned throughout the interwar period, but was manned by the East Riding Heavy Artillery Regiment in 1939. The threat of rapid motor attack boats had escalated by this time, so the fort's weaponry was upgraded to add 2 6-pounder quick-firing guns. Hale Sand Fort was completed in late 1917 and was situated on a hexagonal concrete foundation on a sandbank 1,640 feet off the coast of Lincolnshire. It was a 4-story circular concrete fort coated with mild steel armor. The construction was further strengthened by additional steel supports inside the fort. The structure was topped with a 2-story central battery observation tower that was initially mounted with 2 4-inch quick-firing guns. The fort, like Bull Sand, was manned by the East Riding Heavy Artillery Regiment from 1939 until 1945, when it was armed with 2 12-pounder guns. In 1941, these were reduced to 2 6-pounders. Both forts were decommissioned in 1956. The Hale Sand Fort was sold at an auction for $119,219 in 2018. Thanks for watching. Which one of these mysterious abandoned forts was the most interesting to you? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.